We are scheduled across from flipped classrooms, so we have all the audience there. That's hot topic. I want to talk a little bit about flipped classroom as well. What I want to do today is basically several things. One is a quick overview of what are the available options to do assessment in a MOOC. And hopefully at the end I will convince you that of all the options available, peer assessment is the only one that's actually usable. That's actually universally usable for whatever MOOC that you want to have. So let me dive right into it. Hang on a second. Obviously in this session we're focusing on MOOC, and all of you are familiar with MOOC by now. These are huge classes. The online classes that are free, and what's unique about them is they're not very different from traditional online courses. What's unique about them is the enrollment. It's so huge, and because it's so huge, it also creates a very unique set of challenges for us. Other than that, if you look at a World Campus class, an online class, it's no different from any of them, except for the enrollment. What the problem is that I want to kind of show you is that if you look historically, you look at education, starting from 2,500 years ago until today, we have always been moving in just a single direction. That is, we start out with the education of the privileged few, your Socrates with a few people talking back and forth, and then over time, the only change that we've been heading in is just one direction, that more and more students, in terms of teacher-student ratio, gets bigger and bigger, more and more students per instructor. So this MOOC thing is actually nothing more than a continuation of the whole historical trend, that we go from the education of the privileged few to the education of the masses. And we are getting to a point that now it's quite possible to this education of the masses. And the promise of MOOC is that, in fact, that anybody, regardless of income, social status, that they have access, or culture, or geographic location, they have access to education. The difference, what makes, as we go from this few to many, you can see the major difference we have is obviously a change in the student-teacher ratio. You have more and more students relative to each instructor. So what does that mean? That means if you think back to Socrates, the famous dialogue approach, teacher asks the student a question, student answer, based on the answer, teacher asks the next question. So there's a dynamic interaction constantly. There's feedback going back to the teacher as to whether the student is really understanding or not. And then based on the teacher's assessment, whether the student is understanding or not, the teacher would adjust the next question, which then is the next instruction. So this interaction is a critical part of education. As we look at how education has changed, that interaction gets less and less as we go from a small to a large teacher-to-student ratio, as we get more and more students per teacher. One way of looking at education is education or learning basically is actually what they call an assessment cycle. It's a three-step cycle. You teach, a student learns, then you assess. Based on the assessment, either you adjust the teaching or you give feedback to the student, and the whole cycle repeats itself. That's one of the models of education today. It is this teach, learn, assessment cycle. It loops back and forth. Without any one of them, you don't really have a complete teaching. You don't really have complete learning experience. Well, as we change from very few students per teacher to many students per teacher, for many of the students, this cycle is broken. There's no more assessment feedback, this feedback loop. This feedback As also known, sometimes we use the term formative assessment. Basically, it's this feedback loop, this cycle. When we look at MOOC, now MOOC obviously is taking the problem to an entirely different level. Whereas in a big lecture class with 1,000 students, you can still occasionally have dialogue going on, question and answer. You could have assignments, teacher could grade them. You have teaching assistant that will grade the assignment. You break up the class every Friday into this recitation sessions, and then you have the interaction and so forth. But when you get to MOOC, the instructor-student interaction is practically nil. There's nothing there. It's just impractical. You're talking about 100,000 students, one instructor, there's just simply no interaction. So therefore, that teach-learn cycle is completely broken. There's no more feedback. You have teach, you hope there's learn, and there's no assess, basically. So just teach, teach, teach. So what happens when you actually teach? When you do that? When you have you're not sure about learning, and there's no assessment, what you end up with is basically information dump. Well, basically just a show. No different from watching a movie, watching anything. It's just the broadcasting process. You have no idea once you throw the things out there, what's happening out there. You assume by faith that it's working. People are learning. So the key is that because of the large student-teacher ratio, we're unable to complete this loop. Is it possible that we can put this thing back in, put some sort of formative assessment back in there? May not. Whatever we do, it must not involve the instructor because it's not practical. It has to be something that automated, it may not give feedback to the instructor to change instruction, but will give feedback to the student to tell the student whether he or she is learning the proper thing. So can we build that back into the process? We can do that, but today we look at available method to us. There are about 5 different methods available to us. And what's unique about these 5 methods is these are the methods that would involve very little instructor time, to no instructor time. Because otherwise, it's not practical for MOOC, right? You defeat the purpose of MOOC if you end up having the instructor doing a lot. Because the whole idea is that once you get that there, it's automated. And that you have this huge student to teacher ratio. So I want to review these 5 methods and then to talk about the pros and cons of each of those methods. The one that's most obvious is you see that a lot with many of the courses, online courses. You read something, you watch a video, you read some material, you do a little interaction with the online material, and then there's a set of multiple choice questions. And then you answer it, and there's a score that spits back to you right away. And that's your feedback to you. That tells you whether you get right or wrong. How many questions did you get right? And if you don't get it right, suggestion, go back and reread this part or review this video. This approach has been around for a long time, half a century. Actually, it was originally suggested by B.F. Skinner, except that, of course, they used a different language because there's no computer back then. They call it program instruction or mastery learning. It was very popular for a while. There are many textbooks written at that time that follow this process, and they call modularized instruction. Basically, the whole course is divided into modules. You read and you learn the stuff in the module. At the end of the module, then there's a multiple choice question. You take the test, and it will tell you that if you get 70% or more correct, move on to the next module. Otherwise, go back to the module and relearn it again. So this approach is actually not different from that. Obviously, one of the limitations of this is it's only appropriate for courses that are designed for self-paced. That is, because you have to allow people to go back whenever they want to. Many of the MOOCs today they're divided into modules, but then they have fixed time. So this first week, we cover this topic, and then next week, a new segment comes in. So they're not exactly self-paced in many cases. But the pros and cons, though, is, I don't know if you can see that. Can you see back there? I was trying to fool around with the fonts here. Obviously, the pros of this is it can be implemented easily on any MOOC. You just take the class and you take material out, you write multiple choice questions. Another obvious advantage is machine scoreable. I mean, how many questions get right, and right away it will give you feedback. You get 80% right, you get 20% right. So the advantage is you get the feedback right away. It's machine scoreable. It's easy to implement, except that the limitation is multiple choice. Multiple choice, or sometimes we call select type of exam, where the answer is in there. All you have to do is pick the correct one. You don't have to create, or generate an answer. When you have questions like that, that's appropriate only if you want to test people if they can record information, can they discriminate concepts, can they interpret text or graph correctly, or can they extract information from some stimulus. Those are the limitations of multiple choice. You cannot ask them to generate, you can analyze to some extent, you can synthesize to some extent, provided that you give them the analysis, you give them the synthesis, and then ask them whether it's right or wrong. So it's still not having done to the analysis. So there's a limitation on what can be done, what can be covered. Another practical limitation of multiple choice is it's awfully difficult to write good multiple choice questions. You have to go through a lot of training if you really want to write correct, useful multiple choice questions. So it's very difficult to write good multiple choice questions. And even if you're well trained, it's very difficult to write good questions that were designed to measure high level thinking skills. So you can see multiple choice is very easy to implement and so forth, except that it's only applicable to a very narrow area within this, within MOOC. The alternative, a second option available today is these automated essay scoring algorithm, which is available, well, when you take SAT today, GRE, well, SAT primarily the writing part, and that's scored by machine. Basically, these are pretty sophisticated machines, algorithms. They look for errors in writing and so forth. The problem is these algorithms are all designed to look for mechanical errors in writing. So they're looking at grammatical errors, spelling error, sentence problem, and so forth. So they are primarily developed for evaluating English writing skills today. So what are the pros and cons? Unlike multiple choice, now writing is an exam where people actually produce an answer rather than selecting an answer. So it can handle any open-ended type of writing. It's machine scoreable. It's very quick, just like multiple choice. Right away it can give you a score, and then it will tell you whether you learn or not. The problem is, of course, because it can only handle English writing problems, so it's limited to if your course teaches English writing skills. Now someday, I don't know when, but someday maybe we can come to the point where we can improve on these algorithms. But today, the algorithms that we have can only basically check for mechanical, grammatical errors. Like example I give you would be here, verb-noun agreement. If you run-on sentences, your complex sentences, kind of diagnose your sentence and so forth. But it would not figure out the meaning of sentences. You can write a grammatically correct, highly scored piece of nonsense. Just actually the tutors actually help people how to improve on the TOEFL and SAT writing. And some of the tricks they tell you is always use big, rarely used words. Whether it's appropriate or not, just put it in there. Write longer sentences, because the algorithm, they figure out the algorithm. So the problem is, of course, it cannot detect anything, the meaning of the passage, let alone things like irony, humor, all that stuff, forget it. So it's a limitation, even in writing, if the course is about writing, you have a problem with that. The third option is online forums. So the MOOC, you could, now without giving them a test, no multiple choice, no essay exam, simply tell students, well, go to this online forum, and every MOOC, I think most MOOCs have online forums. So you go to an online forum, and you basically a chat room, and you just submit your questions, and then you ask for answers. How do you handle questions coming from 150,000 people? So typically, the algorithm is that you use basically like the Facebook type of like system. You have everybody else in the system, when they read the question, how many of them like and how many of them dislike. And the ones that get most like then would rise to the top, and then those that get most dislike would be at the bottom. Then the instructor would be, let's say, once every week or every Friday at this hour, would go to the site, go to the online forum, and pick the top questions, these are the most popular questions, and answer them. So you do have some feedback in that case to complete the cycle in terms of learning. What the advantage is? Well, an obvious advantage is it's not dependent on those questions that are being asked in a multiple choice exam or the topic for the essay. The feedback can be continuous because the instructor gives feedback, then there will be a follow-up question and then continue discussion. So it's a continuous, dynamic type of feedback. And it is not like writing, which is limited subject matter, multiple choice, which is only applicable to certain areas. This is applicable to anything. And a more interesting thing about the advantage of this one is that when you test people, multiple choice or essay, you're trying to find out if they get a wrong idea, misconception. But when you write the questions, you only ask questions about those misconceptions that you know about. You don't know there's certain other misconceptions out there that you're not asking. Well, with this method, online forum and so forth, you can actually find new misconceptions that you didn't think was out there. That becomes available through this forum. So this actually is a pretty good alternative, except of course that because this online forum with a like system, you end up answering a very tiny fraction of all the questions the 150,000 people have. Now you end up answering questions from 3 people, basically. So it's very good, but it's only available for a very tiny fraction. So for most of the student, that cycle is still broken. We don't have that feedback. Also, another problem is that what rises to the top is not necessarily the most important question. Whatever is the most popular question, it could be because most of the students misunderstood the material, end up asking a very irrelevant question that's actually not very important. So there's a limitation on that, and in practice, we're not really getting to all the students either. Then there's the flipped classroom idea. The flipped classroom idea, you're all pretty familiar with that. Basically, the whole idea is that have students look on this MOOC material at home, watch the video and all that stuff at home, and learn all the stuff. And then you go to a local classroom. So now MOOC is international, so you're talking about organizing many small local classrooms with a local instructor, and the students come together, and they'll do the assignment, and they'll discuss, and they ask questions, and all that stuff. This flipped classroom approach is actually not very new, because we've basically been doing that in doctoral seminars. In many of the classes that you have taken, the chances are the instructor would give you reading assignments, go home, read the stuff. You come to class, and when in class, all you do is just discuss the stuff, ask questions and so forth. So the assessment, the learning process, the cycle takes place in the classroom, whereas the teach part is at home. The difference we have today is that instead of giving you an assignment to go home and read a book, Now you go home and watch a video, and you watch the online material. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? For those people who actually go to the brick and mortar classroom, they're getting the complete cycle. They have to teach, they have to learn, they have to assess, and they have the complete loop. And then it's dynamic, it's interactive, and it's in time and all that. And it's applicable to all matters, all subject matters. So it's pretty good. Except that, what's the problem here? Only those who pay a fee to go to local instruction, local class, gets this complete cycle. So now you can imagine a MOOC with 150,000 students, you're not going to get 150,000 people paying fees to go to local school. So basically, you're going back to the traditional classroom again. The only difference is now you have them actually read the material ahead of time before you come to classroom. And so I kind of tongue-in-cheek said, then the MOOC becomes moot. Basically, the whole MOOC that was designed to be a complete course now is a multimedia textbook, basically. You go home, look at the stuff, you come back and we'll discuss. Because that part becomes nothing more than just a broadcasting part. And you still have to go pay fee, go to a local school, and work with the instructor to get the rest of the cycle. So it's not really the entire package anymore. And it's not really applicable to the vast majority of people who would not pay fee, cannot afford to go to local school, or you don't have a local classroom for them. Then finally, the fifth solution is peer assessment. We have assignments given within MOOC and have peers, other classmates, grading and giving feedback to the student. And then after that, you have an online forum to combine with that, and you have peer discussion with minimum to no instructor mediation. The instructor is not involved in this. Assignments given, and students submit the assignment, the computer then automatically distribute the assignment to peers, and peers grade them, give feedback, give suggestion, and then you can then submit that your question and or assignment to a public forum within the class, and then they can discuss it. So that's the fifth solution. The advantage of this approach is it applies to anything, not just limited to certain area. Any topic area, you can use peer assessment. It's dynamic, it's tailored to every question, just like flipped classroom, just like the other, the traditional slope, except that the only difference here now is the feedback comes from peers, not from the instructor. That's the only difference. So you have the complete cycle is available to every single student. As long as you participate, you submit your assignment and have people look at it, you grade other people's assignment, that's complete. So what's the drawback? Well, there are a number of them. We find that the student assessors, if you give them the assessment, they usually don't take the job very seriously. Part of that's because they don't believe in it. That's a matter of faith. And the problem is most people think that, well, you have novice grading novice. So it's kind of the blind leading the blind, and so how good are these feedback? Is that really, actually giving wrong information? So students generally do not trust the result of peer assessment. Another problem is if there are common misconceptions, then the peer grading and non-peer will actually reinforce those common misconceptions. So the problem we have is with the peer assessment, it meets all the things that we want. It completes the cycle, it's practical, it's usable, except for the quality of the feedback. So if we can somehow make the quality of peer assessment feedback better, of all the 5 solutions, peer assessment is the one that actually is the best, provided we can improve it. Now, Bart's going to show you some of the peer assessment data that we have at Penn State, And after that, I'm going to talk about a few alternative modifications to peer assessment that actually help us improve the peer assessment results. And if we can do that successfully, then it is the solution. It is the best of all the solutions.
Thanks, Suen. So I just want to give a couple slides to give you an idea of what happens in the current MOOCs that we're offering. A lot of what I think you'll see here reflects a lot of what Hoy was talking about with different MOOC teams taking different strategies in terms of assessment. But we're going to start with a little bit about kind of the whole ratio problem of kind of teacher and support staff to student. So this is just a quick graph to give you an idea of each of the 5 MOOCs we have over on the left: art, maths, creativity, academics, and energy, the number of instructors each MOOC had. And then you can kind of see here, this middle column, this is the people that were helping in terms of the delivery of that MOOC. So how many people were on the team that helped the MOOC kind of flow and move from week to week and get everything done. You can see that it's not very big, right? Especially when you look to that compared to the enrollments over here in the far column. So at most, right, the academics course had 8 instructors, 10 graduate assistants, and 1 instructional designer. So that's not even 20 people to support almost 20,000 people, right? So the stats get really tricky here when you look at, how much support people have to do these and how many students are actually in the course. And this is a glimpse at how different types of assessments were used in the first 5 MOOCs that we ran here at Penn State. So Anna, in the art course, there were 5 quizzes and 5 peer assessment projects. Forum participation, that wasn't a required part of the course. Is that correct, Anna? Okay. I pulled this off a spreadsheet that designers filled out, but since I have the teacher here, I figured I'd ask her for accurate. So that's kind of the way that the art course ran. The maps course also had 5 quizzes, had 5 projects, but forum participation was required. And I know Anthony spent a lot of time in the forums doing somewhat what Hoy mentioned, where students could come and ask questions, and once a week Anthony would produce sometimes even a video that addressed the questions that seemed to float to the top the most. So Anthony spent a lot of time in the forums and using that as part of the completion requirement that people had to participate there. The creativity course, there were 8 quizzes, 2 projects, one of which was peer assessed there. There was no forum participation. Academics, 8 quizzes, 0 projects. They did require participation. Energy, also 12 quizzes, no projects, and they did require participation. So these over here, the quizzes, these are those machine-scored assessments. There were a lot of kind of recall knowledge, things along those lines, all predominantly multiple choice. So they didn't get into some of the things that might be higher order thinking in terms of kind of coming up with your own answers or using some of the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy in the course. So down here at the bottom is just a couple more details about the peer assessment aspect of these. In the art course, all 5 of the art assignments were using peer evaluation. That was probably, in my opinion, the most heavily used peer eval across our 5 MOOCs. The final maps assignment was also using peer evaluation, and I know Patrick did some research on that and still looking at the data to figure out how reliable were these peer assessment assignments by comparing student grades to Anthony's grades. So Anthony's actually graded some of these for kind of a comparison or a benchmark. The creativity course was a little different in that their assignments focused mostly on completion and reflection, not so much the content of the actual assignment. So they did peer assessment, but I would classify it as kind of very informal. So students could post some of their projects on the forum, on Facebook, on Google+. They posted these in a wide variety of places that was just kind of open for other students to come in and provide feedback, provide kind of a layer of peer assessment. But it wasn't quite done like the other 2, which were much more formal. Inside Coursera, they have a whole peer assessment kind of piece of software that the other 2 courses, Arts and Maps, did use. And we collected some information on the end of course surveys and asked students different parts, what helped your learning the most in the course? What do you think could have been done better to support your learning? And these were some of the comments we got. So in terms of peer assessment, these are from the art course. Someone said, I hate the peer assessment as in some cases their anonymity gave the peers an excuse to say mean-spirited things. So anytime you have 40,000 people that are anonymous online, and whether it's a MOOC or not, that's going to happen, right? So a lot of this wasn't unexpected. We thought we'd get some of this. Another person said peer-to-peer evaluation cannot replace the teaching by an expert, and evaluations are not deep and rich enough. Hoy mentioned this whole novice grading novice, and that's kind of what this person was alluding to here. And we pulled some out of the MAPS course as well, some responses there on the peer assessment assignment. So one person said, asking tens of thousands of people to discuss online about anything is stupid. Letting 3 random internet trolls, also known as peers, to decide whether one passes with distinction or not is moron. So there's some probably language barriers here as well, but I think you get the point. And the bottom one, I really dislike the peer assessment. I worked very hard on my map, and out of the reviews, only one offered constructive criticism. The others I questioned if they even looked at my map rather than just the attached image of it. The comments that were made didn't even make sense. So I don't know how many of you have enrolled in a MOOC and done any peer assessment assignments. The hard part here that some of these students seem to have indicated is that depending on how serious and knowledgeable your assessors are, there's usually about 3 to 5 people assessing you, is really going to dictate the value you get out of that assignment in terms of a learning experience. Right? There was one assignment, a MOOC that I was in, where I gave an assignment that required not only a scoring rubric of my work, but required open-ended feedback. And 3 of the 4 pieces of feedback I got, the end user just typed a spacebar and hit enter, or typed ASDF and hit enter. So I got no feedback based on an assignment that, I spent a couple hours putting together. So that gets really frustrating. For someone like me, that's very demotivating, and that's why I drop out of MOOCs sometimes, because I'm putting in a lot of effort and not getting anything kicked back out of it. So these are some of the negatives, and I'm highlighting the negatives here. There were equal parts positive as well. And again, I think it all depends on who you get on the other side of that assessment screen and how serious they're taking it. And if they're serious and committed, I think it'll be a very valuable experience and you'll get a lot out of it. But if they're just there to, kind of click a couple buttons and rush it through, you're really not going to get a lot of useful information out of that experience. So I want to turn it back over to Hoy to talk a little bit about different types of peer assessments and how we can kind of move away from some of the more random aspects.
These methods that I'll be reviewing, in the long run, hopefully, once we get things going and get it fixed, that we can actually improve the credibility of peer assessment. And as a result, some of these maybe will minimize some of these perception. But when you have so many people, you're bound to have some people will be very negative on that. So very quickly, the whole idea of basic assessment, basic peer assessment, is the most basic form is that you have some common rubric, scoring rubric. When you have the assignment or whatever work that students submit, you distribute each piece of work to a handful of peer raters, 2, 3 to 5 in most cases. And then each person then would rate the assignment and write comment. Now in most cases, the assignment of peer raters are random because that's the most, probably the practical solution. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then you give either each rater's response, sometimes you give the average or the median rating back to the student as feedback. That's the very basic form. And that's the reaction from most people, the negative reaction and so forth. It's just because a lot of these features, number one, we have no idea. In most cases, the rating is probably not that good. And other times when you end up with just by chance, you end up with 5 or poor raters or with wrong ideas, and they'll end up giving you feedback that's not only not useful, sometimes was misleading. So how can we improve on that? Well, and then of course discussion online. To improve that, there are a number of constraints that we have to work with in terms of what we can do to improve this. We must not involve the instructor too much, otherwise it defeats the whole purpose of doing this whole thing. We don't want to involve the raters and have to do a lot of rater training, because you have even 10,000 people going through the training. The only training we can have is just online, have them read something and then practice a little bit. That's about all. So very little rater training. You don't want to spend a lot of, address that a little bit later on. This has to do with dropout rate. And you don't want them to spend a lot of time doing the rating exercise. So you want very minimal information from them. And yet you want that to produce credible results. So those are constraints that we work within. Currently, there's one method, and Coursera actually implements this in their software. This is a method that came out of UCLA for a traditional peer assessment called the calibrated peer review approach, Basically what you do is you have students rating some classroom assignment, but before that, you do a calibration process. And what you do is you come up with some sort of what we call ground truth work, and that is work that's of known quality already. So from previous semester, or the instructor pick something out or make something up, and send that to every single student, and have them rate that assignment, write comment, rate that assignment. This, in our work, we call it the fake assignment. It's not really a peer assignment, it's something from previous, known quality, okay? But the student had no idea about that. Basically, this is an assignment just like all the other assignments. So have the student rate that. Then we look at how closely the student's rating resembles that of the instructor, so as a measure of accuracy. So we're talking about the distance between the rating of the student and that of the instructor. So under this system, then that difference is an indication of how incompetent the rater is. So we can use that as a weight to the person. So that when you give the feedback back to the student with the 5 raters, each rater gets a different weight based on how bad they are. So on the calibrated project, the whole purpose of that is to come up with a weight for each instructor, each peer rater. And then you use that weight to apply to the actual assignment and give a weighted average back to the individual student as feedback. Then that weight can also be used, and I'll talk a little bit later on if we have time, you can also use that to kind of guide your forum too, because those with a smaller error are supposed to be better. Well, this method, and then you get the written comment. What we've been working on here at Penn State is a refinement of this, because we realize there's a lot of problem with the CPR system. Because the calibration, just because they did pretty well in calibration doesn't mean that they'll do well on the actual assignment. So we looked at several factors. We looked at how accurate, we're still using this calibration process, this ground truth process. But we want to get information on how accurate they are, how consistent they are, and also if the accuracy, the level of accuracy, is it transferable from one topic to another, one assignment to another assignment? When we do that, the minimum information is we have to have them do 2 calibrated ground truth assignments. On each one of them, we ask them actually 3 pieces of information. How do you rate this? And what's the highest rating you're willing to give? And what is the lowest rating you're willing to give? By giving, so each person at the calibration process, we ask for 6 pieces of information. That is, look at 2 projects, each one give us 3 pieces of information. Based on that, we do our little mathematical, statistical manipulation behind that to give different weights, and we end up with something called a credibility index. And so each student gets a credibility index from this calibration process. Then when we give the actual assignment, then we'll use that as weight. And so the process is very similar to the CPR, except that we look more comprehensively without adding a lot more information to the accuracy. We have collected some data on the creativity MOOC. The only information we have from that is more a proof of concept at this point, that it worked so far, but whether it's better than CPR, we have tentative data that shows that it's better, but not cogent enough for a, let's say, scientific journal. So we're going to look for another opportunity to kind of redo the experiment to tightly control to show that. But this whole approach is designed to improve on the CPR without adding a lot of information, without adding a lot of demand on the rater. There's also another approach that's been proposed about a year ago, a Bayesian post-hoc correction approach. Without going into the detail of that, basically, those of you familiar with empirical Bayes, basically, it's an empirical Bayesian type of process. You don't need to do anything, you just do these. You don't even need to do calibration, you just use the basic rating. And then, in essence, what you're trying to do is you let the the rater, the pool of the rater, kind of stabilize individual random error, in essence. So in Bayesian, you impose something called prior distribution, and these are theoretical distributions you impose on the distribution of scores, and then you mathematically stabilize them using this iterative process, something called an EM algorithm. So all that don't need anything other than just simply the data itself. This was developed out of Stanford. The whole process actually reduced the random error of raters. And based on their research, they found that it reduced the error by about 19 to 30%. Those are the random, careless type of error in rating. But systematic error, biases, and other stuff still will not be handled by this method, which will have to go back to the credibility index. Obviously, the ideal eventually is to combine the three methods because each method is designed to handle a different type of error. And peer raters have a lot of different errors, and they come from different sources. And credibility index, the CPR, and the Bayesian method, they all handle small pieces. Some of them are overlapping, but then together I think we can remove most of the error. So this is where we at. If we can validate the peer assessment, then our next step is validate the credibility index. Next step is work out the actual system to combine, and I can already see that we use the credibility index, follow it up with a Bayesian process, and that will probably give us the most accurate results. Now, what would that do? Obviously, the thing is we end up with more accurate because the weighted average. We envisioned each student would get the feedback from the peers. Here are the 5 peers. On average, here's your score, and here's the most credible feedback, this next most credible, etc., based on the credibility index value. So we can facilitate the learning with the system. We can also envision, obviously not as we come up with some sort of system eventually that's more palatable, but some way of, in the forum right now, the most popular questions rise to the top. The most popular answers rise to the top. We want to have the most credible answer rise to the top. And how do we use that? Instead of the like and dislike, maybe the credibility index can be used to have kind of rank order these comments. The person with the best credibility index will go up. Now, additionally, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention is that we can also envision that as each new assignment comes in, we could have the instructor raise some of these assignments in order to refine the credibility index. So now we have ground truth. So the credibility index gets more and more accurate week by week. Every time you use it, we get additional information. We can improve on the credibility index. So we can see that being used for online discussion. We can also see that eventually, now I'll talk a little bit about that on summative evaluation. Right now one of the problems that we have is because this random assignment of peers, so there's a very good chance that you end up with all 5 lousy peers. Or you get, if you're lucky, you get 5 very good peers. If we have the credibility index, we can draw a stratified sample. So each person gets a balanced good and bad raters rather than somebody getting all bad raters or some good raters. So that's another application of that. Problems. Peer assessment, any MOOC that has peer assessment is found to have the worst completion rate. Now, we're not sure whether it's because of peer assessment or because those classes that use peer assessment tend to require open-ended projects, and people would rather not do the open-ended projects. Multiple choice, I don't care. I can answer it, but then if I do it, I won't. But there's always the potential peer assessment will aggravate the problem. The summative part I talk about, people talk about possibility of using peer assessment for badges, for example. It's possible if we can make credibility index pretty good, that we end up with good results, except there are some potential legal problem on that. Peer assessment so far has been okay if we use peer assessment for formative assessment purposes. The US Supreme Court ruled that it does not violate FERPA if you use peer assessment for formative, because FERPA has to do with student record. And if you start using it for badges, then it becomes part of student record, I think. Now, of course, we need to talk to a lawyer about that. So potentially, there may be a limitation on using peer assessment for end of course grading or badges, but maybe maybe a lawyer looks at that and say no problem. I don't know, but there's a potential pitfall for that. So we really don't know at this point. That's I see that I was getting alert to the time and perfect timing. I'm pretty much done. Thank you. Questions, comments?
Stop right on the dot. Keith?
Do we have any reason to believe that if we eliminate anonymity in one way, shape, or form from the responses, does some of the problem go away if the graders know that their comments can be fed back to them?
I think in the traditional classroom we found that to be true, but not in the book. Because, so I give you a fake name from Sri Lanka.
One of the problems is that people might not actually fulfill their feedback requirements, just put a space bar or a space or whatever. And the idea of having continued adjustments to that index, I think that's a way of kind of keeping them on task. But I was wondering if another option might be some sort of a peer-to-peer grader feedback, kind of like the eBay seller rating, you know. Thumbs up, you gave me a good rate, good feedback. Thumbs down, you gave me a bad one, and then you can incorporate that somehow maybe into the index or into their grade or something like that.
I think there's a lot of potential in that. I'm not sure the mechanism for that, how that's going to work out. The difference between the credibility index and the like or the Amazon review and all that stuff is that the credibility index is calibrated, so the high index means they are more knowledgeable, or
right.
We hope. And all these other systems, all it means is they're more popular. And they're not always the same.
We found looking at forum data in our MOOCs, there's the same kind of thing. You can, thumb up in the forum data. And we looked at the people at the top and the bottom in terms of most votes and most thumb down, so the bottom group. And the people at the top typically had very positive supporting things to say, like, no, don't drop out, or, this looks really great, keep on working on it. Those were all the people at the top. The people at the bottom were often very, very knowledgeable and responding in very knowledgeable ways, but they were doing it with a snarky, bad attitude. So anonymity is actually an interesting example, because someone wrote this great post on one of the forums about why posting your name on a MOOC forum might be something to think twice about. And you could tell that they had a lot of security background, and they ended with, and anybody using their name's a moron. Thumbs down and you.
Yeah. But then it still raises the point that what encourages people to learn better, it's not just having the correct information, it's also that interaction with other people. And if even if a response is not as informative but nicer, you're still going to learn that perhaps better than being totally turned off by the last word.
Yeah.
Very informative post.
Yeah.
There might still be a
Yeah, absolutely.
I imagine eventually the system would require many different changes. So this is one step at a time. Let's get the accuracy part working first, and then let's put all the other stuff in there as well. There's a question back there.
So what if we took the ground truth, instead of calibrating it to the instructor, we categorized it with the students. So we took people who were, we weighted them based on the groups that they were kind of categorized within that assessment. And then we're able to grows in how they respond or providing feedback, we kind of clump them together because that's maybe what they want or need from that course. I wonder if there'd be persistent in the course if people were actually able to obtain peer feedback from their like peers.
Actually, that's a very good point. The whole Bayesian approach is based on the idea that I guess, crowdsourcing, the wisdom of the crowd type of thing. The whole Bayesian thing is the combined information is the correct information. And so they're trying to reduce error by making everybody more similar. The connectivist MOOC basically is the same idea. But if we want to calibrate on how a person is similar to the crowd or the median of the crowd, that would be going in that direction. Now, I can envision doing the credibility index first. And once we get it done, instead of every week trying to have the instructor redo another batch in order to kind of refine the credibility index, all future refinement of your credibility index is based on your first, the grouping of people. So how similar are you to those people who are credible? But that would be putting a lot of faith in that first calibration.
But doesn't that further the bias of the instructor if you base the credibility on whatever the closer to being weighted on the instructor?
So it's a matter of the subject matter, right? There's certain subject matters that the teacher or the instructor is the expert, that has the correct answer, correct concept. There are certain topic areas that you require crowdsourcing. But in that case, it's a different story altogether. But most of the MOOCs today that we have, I have not really seen a lot of connectivist MOOC. Most of the MOOC are more traditional, that the instructor, never mind what medium they use, is still the sage. It's just a sage, it's not on the stage, that's all, right? That person still knows the answer, has written the book, has designed the course material, and so that we have no higher authority at this point, basically.
All right, well, thank you very much. We're running a little late, so enjoy the next session.
Thank you.